What's up, hobby friends? In this video series, probably won't be fairly frequent, but I'll release them as I get a chance to. I want to talk about each of the different affiliations I play for Marvel Crisis Protocol, talk about why I decided to get into each of the affiliations, what I like about them, what I don't like, and then talk about my approach to the game with each of these, I'm going to say the word affiliations a lot, but affiliations. It's a way for me to show off the models I have for my collection and just talk about my approach to the game with that team, how I approach picking the crises, building the team roster, and then picking the tactics cards. And because I do recognize that the game of Marvel Crisis Protocol is constantly evolving, Atomic Mass has done a very good job of continuously releasing new characters that change the power landscape of the game. They also update the tactics cards, they update their banned and restricted list, and most recently they've introduced the element of timelines, having standard versus extended, also cutting out a lot of cards that are no longer in play. It does mean that the game is constantly evolving, constantly changing. And rather than release a video of specific points of, oh, you want to take these characters versus not these characters, or these cards are good, but these cards aren't, so you should never take them, I want to caveat that I'm talking about the game at this point in time when the video is released. And I want to talk less so about do's and don'ts in terms of specifics, but more in generalities. I want to talk about my approach or my thinking or my reasoning behind some of the choices I make, so that in the future, when the game does change, you're able to take the approach, take the understanding, and then apply that to future choices and future decisions. So the first team that I'm going to be talking about are my Web Warriors. So I grew up watching the Spider-Man cartoons and reading the Spider-Man comics. And so while I was initially hesitant to get into the game of Marvel Crisis Protocol, being able to feel the Web Warriors on the table, I think was really what drew me in. Was able to sort of reenact the narrative of the cartoons growing up, and it really just smashed that nostalgia button for me. And it kind of steamrolled from there, where once I clicked the Web Warriors, I ended up branching off into A-Force and a bunch of other affiliations, which I will cover down the road. But for this video, we're talking about the Webheads. So talking briefly about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Web Warriors. So for me, their ability to play the movement and control game, I think, is one of the greatest assets. And while they aren't the most heavy-hitting of teams, the flexibility of play that they get from just the way that they can approach each of the different crises and matchups means that they're probably one of the more flexible teams to play. They have a lot of options in terms of moving around the board, being able to push and pull models off objectives, and then either forcing you to drop tokens or taking them from you from some of their heroes. They're also surprisingly cheap in terms of their threat. A lot of their heroes sit in the 3 threat, couple of 4s, and 1 5 when you're talking about in affiliation. And so you're able to build a very strong core that's very low threat cost and still have room to splash in some heavy hitters either from the affiliation or from outside and not feel like you're being stretched too thin in what you want to do. Being able to take your very strong, flexible core for almost no threat cost at all means that you can build a very strong center for your roster and still have room to bring in a lot of fun toys that you want to play either for the specific crises or whether you just want to play a narrative game that you have a hero you want to play on the tabletop. Tying into their ability to play the movement and control game, I think they can snowball the victory point game very easily. If you pick the right crises and you grab the objectives very early on, they can run away with the victory points game to the point where it's almost impossible to catch up very early on. So that even if you start taking the hits and you start losing your players, you've already secured that early lead where it makes it very difficult for your opponent to play catch up from. In terms of their weaknesses, I think they have a very predictable gameplay and a very predictable core. And I'll talk about this later on when I'm diving into their roster building. But in terms of roster building, Web Warriors tend to bring the same 3 or 4 heroes, which does make their game plan a little bit predictable. And I feel like not taking those core characters or those core pieces, splashing in others, takes away from the Web Warriors playstyle. And while it does make your game plan a little bit more unpredictable, you're now veering away from what Web Warriors do want to do. They are also very power hungry and power starved. Because they don't hit particularly hard in combat, they're not going to generate a lot of power like some other affiliations. And a lot of what they want to do, a lot of their abilities require a lot of power. So chances are, early on, you're not going to have access to a lot of your superpowers and abilities to push and pull. And you're going to have to be very careful about how you spend your power unless you start exposing your pieces to taking hits and then generating power that way. I've found that in turns where I have a lot of power to spend, it's usually following a turn where one or two of my heroes just got dazed and generated a lot of power from taking hits. It can also make for a very non-interactive game because Web Warriors want to keep their opponents at arm's length and play the objective game, not so much the hitting game. It can make for a very discouraging experience, especially against players who are fairly new to the game. So if you're looking to play something a little bit more casual, you're trying to get someone to get into the game, playing Web Warriors against them may not be the route you want to take. Tying into their need for power, Web Warriors, because they're not a combat affiliation, don't hit particularly hard outside of their one turn where they play all webbed up. And I'll talk about that later on, but essentially they're pretty one-dimensional in play. They're always going to want to play the control game for objectives. And scenarios or teams or crises that force them to bunch up really hampers the way that they want to play and can really hurt their ability to score victory points, which ties into, I think, one of their biggest weaknesses is the fact that I think they are a snowball team. I think they are feast or famine and they want to get ahead early and they want to get ahead fast. If they come up against a team or opponent or a crisis matchup where they aren't able to start running away with their victory points and they could even start falling behind, it can be very difficult for them to play catch up. So some of my general strategies for playing the Web Warriors, the first is having a high objective count that forces play to be spread across the board. I don't want to have a couple of especially secure objectives where I have to be at 1 or 2 points holding some high value targets. I want to force the game to be spread out where I'm able to play a lot of one-on-one or two-on-one skirmishes. If I have to clump up into a big scrum in the center around 1 or 2 objectives, it's going to make the game very hard for me. My second general strategy is I typically want to activate last, especially early on when I want to control the objectives and snowball victory points. I want to make sure that I have the last activation so that I can push and pull enemy models off of secures and basically deny them points while I take points. If I can secure a 2 or 3 point lead very early on for the first 2 points by denying a couple of key secures, I've given myself a confident buffer where I can afford to then start trading health points. I can start trading dazed or knocked out models to secure those last few game-winning points. So when it comes to building your team, so you're picking your 6 crisis cards, your 3 secures, 3 extracts, you're picking your roster of 10 heroes, and you're picking your 10 tactics cards, I'm going to be talking purely about standard play. My assumption is we're not talking about casual or narrative where you're sort of just picking things for fun. And the aim being that you're looking to play in an event or a tournament, something where you actually have to have those 3 core elements picked out and not changing them from game to game. So you're basically approaching it with, I'm going to be playing a series of games against a bunch of opponents. I don't know who they are. And I need to have a strong game plan going in. So the order that we always want to pick them in is, at least in my opinion, you want to pick your crises first. You then want to pick your heroes. And then finally, your tactics cards. Now, the reason being is that I think of crises cards as your task, and then your roster as your primary tools, and then your tactics cards as your supplementals. So if you were to think about any task that you have to do, any sort of assignment, you can't pick your tools, you can't build a strategy until you understand what that task is, what you are aiming to accomplish. And if I were trying to hammer a bunch of nails if I were trying to hammer a bunch of nails into a piece of wood, I'm not going to bring a screwdriver, right? That's the wrong tool for the task. So I couldn't then say, oh, I'm going to bring, the tool I need is a screwdriver. And then I'm told, okay, well, the task is to hammer a bunch of nails. It's always task first, then the tools. So I think of crisis cards as the task. It's what you have to accomplish. And then once you know what you want to accomplish, you can then pick the tools to help you in the most efficient or effective way to accomplish that task. When it comes to Web Warriors, like I already mentioned, you want to pick mission objectives that have your assets spread out. You actually want to have ideally 4 or 5 assets on the board for each of your secures and extracts, and you want them to be low points. That way you can have as many heroes holding as many points as possible, rather than have to focus on 1 or 2 centralized objective points and asset tokens where it's an all or nothing deal. So when you're looking at the deployment types, you're typically going to be focusing on missions that have deployment types of B, D, and F. And I'll throw this on the screen, but essentially they force a spread out style of play, or in the case of F, it's objective saturation. Having 5 points on the board means that you need a lot of models spread out on different points, as opposed to something like a deployment type of A, which has, and I think this might be only a Wakanda herbs deployment, which is kind of irrelevant. But if you're looking at C or E, where it's focusing a line of scrimmage in the center, or E, which I think is Gamma. So having a high value objective in the center of the board focuses models to have to scrum, which is not Web Warriors' cup of tea. The crisis cards that I tend to prefer for my, and I'll talk about the extracts first, your reds, because that's why I think the Web Warriors excel. So my 3 of choice are Struggle for the Cube Continues, Spider Infected Invade Manhattan, and then Fear Grips World as Worthy Terrorized Cities. So essentially cubes, spider people, and hammers. All 3 of these objectives play on F or D with 4 and 5 objectives. It spreads it all out, and they're all only worth 1 point each. I'm not really going to count the interacts because they do have some funky things that you may not want to pick depending on the team that you're facing. But overall, the thinking behind them is objective points spread out. It plays into a very sort of chaotic game where you do need to be everywhere on the board. And then only holding 1 point isn't going to skew the game. It's not like a Kree power core that's worth 2 victory points, and that's the only secure on the board where you either hold it or you don't. Caveating that hammers can be a very tricky objective to play because it does make the objective holder very strong, and certain heroes can become oppressive if they have 1 or 2 hammers. So I'm thinking Hulk, Corvus Glaive, Thanos. Basically, any heavy hitters that become incredibly strong holding 1 or 2 hammers, you might want to drop hammers in favor of the Montesi formula found. This does only have 3 objective tokens, but it does spread them out on an E, and they're also low points, so it's not all or nothing. And I think this is a suitable alternative to hammers. Secures are a little harder for Web Warriors to play around because they don't want to be stuck holding certain points. But there are still some decent secures where you do spread out on the board. And so my top 4 choices are Cosmic Invasion, Black Order Descends on Earth, Infinity Formula Goes Missing, Riots Spark over Extremis 3.0, and then Portals Overrun City with Spider People. All 4 of them have 4 objective tokens spread across the board. They're a combination of secure and control, so you can either flip them and then move away, or you have to stay there and hold them. But because they are spread out, it's not 1 or 2 points, it's 4 on the board. You can still play that push and pull, and you're not forced to scrum around a centralized point. You can pick and choose the points of the board that you want to hold. And then because they're all only worth 1 point, you're not going to be penalized for not holding them all. Something you're going to notice as well is that all of these crisis cards are at 17 and 18 threat, with Cosmic Invasion being 16. So I think that the 16 to 18 threat range is actually probably the magic number for Web Warriors. It allows them to bring enough toys and enough activations while forcing their opponent to make tough choices in their own roster. Certain affiliations that don't have a lot of access to cheap heroes. So I'm thinking Black Order, especially if they want to take Thanos, the Brotherhood, especially with Magneto and Scarlet Witch, A-Force, because they're forced to take She-Hulk, and then even Asgard, because they're all 4 threat, can struggle to bring enough heavy hitters at a low threat value where they're able to cover the board effectively very quickly, which is one of Web Warriors' strengths. So for example, if you're only playing a 15 or 16 threat, Web Warriors can probably bring 5 activations where Brotherhood or even Black Order with Thanos could only bring 3. That already gives you a leg up if there are 5 objective tokens for extraction and 4 secures on the board. You're more easily able to cover all of them early on, whereas a team that only has 3 or 4 activations is forced to make hard choices and only commit to 1 or 2, which plays into that snowball game. Of course, this does factor a little harder when you're playing affiliations that can also play wide. So when you're playing the mirror match against other Web Warriors, if you're playing Avengers or Avenger Spam with Sam Wilson, and I think Cabal and Crime Syndicate can also do a fairly wide roster. It brings it more on par, but I think Web Warriors, with their high mobility, their ability to wall crawl, and then their access to a lot of pushes and pulls, still have a natural advantage. So in terms of picking your 10-man roster of heroes, I'll talk briefly about the Web Warriors specifically, and then branch into what you're looking for in heroes that you're going to be splashing into your roster. So for the Web Warriors, you're going to have Amazing Spider-Man and Miles Morales as your 2 leaders. And then you'll have Ghost Spider, Black Cat, Venom, Core Spider-Man, Moon Knight, and Daredevil. So in terms of your core models are the ones that you're going to be taking in every single roster, I think are Amazing Spider-Man, Miles Morales, Ghost Spider, and Black Cat. Having Miles Morales and Amazing Spider-Man as your 2 leader options gives you incredible flexibility. Miles Morales is going to be your go-to leader because of his rerolls from his leadership ability, just increasing the defenses of your heroes. Because you're not particularly tanky, having him just increases your ability to take a few hits and survive to swing back. And then in the mirror match or against other affiliations that have a lot of fast heroes but don't hit particularly hard, having Amazing Spider-Man and the ability to hand out slows every single turn can really make the game infuriating to play, especially in the mirror match. Miles Morales and Black Cat are also 2 of the few heroes in the game that, without the use of tactics cards, can force opponents to drop tokens or take tokens from your opponent. And then Ghost Spider, I think, is probably one of the best 3 threats in the game. She's got amazing flexibility in her toolkit with her ability to pull enemies off objectives if you have enough power. Her lifeline can pull heroes in defensive mode. So when they're taking a hit, you can pull them away and protect them. And then her spider technique, I believe it is, where you can hit, move, gives her a lot of flexibility in being able to have some amazing action economy. As far as 5 threats go, Amazing Spider-Man isn't going to make it into every single game you play. But for a 5 threat, I think he is incredible value. He doesn't do anything particularly well outside of moving very fast, but he's such a toolbox character with a surprisingly defensive stat line in combination with his rerolls. And then his witty banter, further increasing your sort of defensive abilities in an AoE around him, just means that he's a great force multiplier and he's a great way to anchor your line. In a pinch, he can be used to hold a central objective where you may be forced to play a bit of a scrum, and he'll last long enough to buy you at least some time to swing the points or bring in some reinforcements. In terms of some of the more situational characters, I think Venom and Daredevil, great to have in your roster, but can be particularly hard to play. Venom is pretty tanky, but he's weak to energy. He's a decent bruiser, but I think he's a little pricey at 4 threat. And with the removal of extreme conditioning, is incredibly slow. You're relying on Lethal Protector to try and get him up the board fairly quickly, which does mean eating up one of your tactics cards. But he does have a few advantages. He's got a decent attack profile, and his web snare means that he's a sort of budget ghost spider in his ability to pull models in a close range off of objectives. So if you want to stay in Affiliation for narrative, he's a pretty decent 4th threat. I just think that if I'm going to be spending the 4th threat, I'd probably actually rather splash another hero for other reasons I'll talk about in a moment. Daredevil, fast, wall crawler, decent attack profile, but what you're looking for is Devil's Deliverance, which is really good in a scrum. The problem is you're doing two things, or I guess you're doing one thing you don't want to be doing as a web warrior is you want to be centralized. And the second is it's incredibly power hungry and very difficult to pull off. So I actually think that he doesn't fit into my pure web warriors rosters because he's so difficult to play. Although what I often do with my web warriors is I dual affiliation with A-Force, and with She-Hulk as my leader, Daredevil actually becomes a much more viable choice because of his ability to generate power very quickly, and I'll talk about that when I talk about splashing heroes. I haven't played with Moon Knight a lot, so I can't really say on how effective he is on the tabletop, but for a 3-threat, being a wall crawler, stealth, he's on paper pretty good. He has access to a Mystic Spender, which does diversify your attack profile a little bit. And then if you're taking Miles, Ghost, and Black Cat, and you want to take a 4th wall crawler without taking Amazing Spider-Man so that you can run 6 wide at a lower threat value, I think Moon Knight is a great character to throw in just because he's a 3-threat hero. So in terms of splashing heroes, you're going to be looking to do a couple of key things to shore up some of your web warrior weaknesses. So one of the core weaknesses of the web warriors is the fact that almost all of their attack profiles are physical defense. They have very little energy and almost no mystic attacks. So having characters that can do energy or mystic means that you can tackle certain heroes that may be stronger on physical defense, but weaker on energy or mystic. And the first one that comes to mind is Carnage. I think Carnage is the antithesis of Web Warriors in the sense that he answers a lot of what Web Warriors wants to do, and he will absolutely have a field day demolishing Web Warriors. The moment you bring a hero that can do any sort of energy or mystic attacks, however, Carnage falls off because he can't defend himself. He's incredibly fragile against those kinds of attacks, and being able to remove him from the game means that, for example, Spider Foes just can't run Venom against you. So if you're looking for models that can do that, you're looking at maybe at Hawkeye, Scarlet Witch, Domino, for example, Crystal, all have attacks that aren't physical, while also bringing other things that do shore up some of your other weaknesses. So another one of Web Warriors' weaknesses is their inability to hold the line. Venom is okay, Amazing Spider-Man, okay, but they're not as strong as like a She-Hulk or a Hulkbuster or a Doctor Strange, whether it's original or Supreme. Having a super tanky model that can also hit very hard holding the line for you opens up your ability to play crises that force you to group or clump up. So if you're looking to splash heroes that can hold the line, maybe those are heroes that you're looking for. You can also start looking at heroes that in their toolbox can help to accentuate some of the play that you want to do. So if you want to lower enemy defenses to make your web warriors hit more effectively, Domino and Cable are also really good. And if you want to splash in some bad guys, Toad can also handle Incinerate and is a 2-threat. Speaking of 2-threats, I think you also want to have at least one 2-threat in your roster, largely because when you start stacking certain characters, you may find that their threat value leaves you with that weird sort of 1 or 2 threat value that you want to fill, and you have to sort of play a bit of team building Tetris to get the heroes that you want to fit in. Having at least 1 2-threat gives you a flexibility to play a little wider and take a higher threat while subbing in a somewhat effective 2-threat character. If you're sticking purely with good guys, my go-to choice is Okoye. Very good toolkit, very surprisingly defensive with her martial artist and leader of the Dora Milaje. And then her ability to bodyguard means that with some power, she can protect one of your backline heroes. Again, if you're splashing in bad guys because you don't care about narrative, or you aren't held up like I am in the head narrative of good guys stay with good guys, bad guys stay with bad guys, Toad is an excellent choice. Decent move, wall crawler. He interacts at 2 instead of 1 for objectives, which makes him great for objective play. He's very slippery with his hop and slippery. Energy attacks, acid, throwing out incinerate. He brings a lot of tools that web warriors want to take advantage of. I personally wouldn't bring him because he's a bad guy, but if you're playing for tournament play and you're looking to win, I think he's an amazing 2 threat. And then finally, characters like Shuri, who can push enemies off objective, especially without spending power. Very good for objective play, and then especially if you're looking to activate last. Both she and Ghost Spider make amazing last activations because they can push and pull multiple enemy models off of objectives. Again, swinging points in your favor. One of the things that I like to do as well with the Web Warriors is actually running a dual affiliation. It's not something you want to do often just because running one affiliation tends to skew you towards taking a certain number of heroes and a certain number of tactics cards for that affiliation. Taking 2 of them means that you are doubling up. You have less options for some unaffiliated cards. And then your roster choices are limited because you have to be able to run at least 3 or 4 of each of the affiliation in order to fulfill being affiliated at 5 and 6 wide teams. But I think there are certain advantages for certain teams, and Web Warriors are one of them. My go-to is A-Force because you can run a lot of what Web Warriors want to do with She-Hulk as the leader, and it actually fills up a lot of the weaknesses of the Web Warriors. Admittedly, you do lose some of the defensive abilities and the tactics cards of the Web Warriors, but I think what you gain with She-Hulk, her leadership ability and power generation, her bodyguard for survivability, especially in crises where you're now forced to fight in a centralized place. She's a tank, she's a bruiser, she's defensive by absorbing all the hits for you, and then by absorbing hits, she hands out power, which mitigates your power-starved weakness for Web Warriors. It gives you power to do the things that you want to do. It opens up the ability to run a lot of Web Warriors like Daredevil. Ghost Spider can do a lot of what she wants to do. And then being able to splash a lot of the really good characters I talked about that are also A-Force. Domino, Crystal, Scarlet Witch, Shuri, Okoye. These are all A-Force members. So you can still play a movement control style game for Web Warriors or with Web Warriors in the A-Force with She-Hulk. Now, I will have another video specifically talking about A-Force released later on because that is also another affiliation I play. But I just want to talk about it very briefly here because I think that Web Warriors are one of the few affiliations that do benefit greatly from running a dual affiliation because certain affiliations do plug a lot of gaps that Web Warriors have. Wakanda or Asgard, also really good dual affiliations for Web Warriors to run. And then finally, once you've got your crises picked and you've got your roster of characters picked out, it's time to finish out with your tactics cards. And these are your supplemental tools based on the characters you're choosing, the affiliations you're running, whether you're dual affiliating or single affiliating, and then how you want to play the game. So in terms of specific Web Warriors affiliated cards, you have All Webbed Up, Aunt May's Wheat Cakes, and Spider Tracker. I think all 3 of them are great, and I would always take them in a Web Warriors roster. All Webbed Up is essential because it's the one turn that's going to make your Web Warriors hit like a truck. You hand out slow, and then you gain additional damage or additional attack dice against slow targets. Really great in the mirror, and it makes all of your 4 or 5 dice builders suddenly hit like 7 or 8 dice spenders. Really good card. Aunt May's Wheat Cakes is just great because it's free healing across the board for all your Web Warriors heroes, and it also removes slow. So we're all webbed up, hands out slow, and then in the mirror match, when you're playing Amazing Spider-Man handing out slows, if you're playing against web warriors that play all webbed up against you, or Amazing Spider-Man is handing out slows against you left, right, and center, having Aunt May's weak cakes to remove that slow is invaluable, and then heals is always good, especially since they're so hard to get. And then Spider Tracker, it's free movement, and especially against models that want to get within close range to hit you. When they move up against you, being able to redeploy a small advance could mean the difference between them being able to hit you and not hit you. So I think that's also an amazing card, fantastic to have. In terms of other cards I think that you need to have, or that I would have in my roster, are Patch Up and Brace for Impact. You don't have a lot of access to heals, and being able to remove damage from a hero, it buys you time. Now, in the standard timeline, they removed Medkit, so you can no longer undaze a hero, which I think also just increases the value of Patch Up because you remove up to 5 damage. It does cost power, a lot of power, and it is also one of your restricted cards, so you need to be careful about taking Patch Up, but I think it's a great card, very utility, and then depending on if you splash other heroes that aren't particularly as tanky, so I'm thinking models like the Hulk, Hulkbuster, Scarlet Witch, and then if you're running a dual affiliation with A-Force, She-Hulk as an example, who can't afford to daze because they knock out, being able to remove up to 5 health is just gold. And then the other one, Brace for Impact. You're seeing a lot of characters now that can throw either you or terrain into you. Being able to negate that damage or negate the throw entirely could actually win you the game. I've had too many games where I have 1 or 2 heroes who are on 1 health and my opponent just throws them. They take the 1 damage, they daze or they knock out, and they drop a token, and suddenly I'm down like 2 or 3 points, I'm out in activation or a hero. Being able to just say no can literally win you the game. And I think if you drop Patch Up for Indomitable to also negate a throw or a push can also be really valuable, especially because it negates the push or throw entirely and you stay where you are. So if they're trying to push or pull you off an objective, you deny that for a turn. Of these 3 cards, they are restricted, so you only get 2 of them. I think either Patch Up and Brace for Impact or Indomitable and then Brace for Impact. You're not going to feel bad taking 2 of the 3. And then in terms of the other 5 cards you take, it's really up to you. There's no right or wrong answer. I think taking certain heroes will necessitate taking certain cards to take advantage of it. So for example, if you have Peter Parker and Black Cat, having the cat and spider to be able to gain extra throw and objective interaction is always good. If you're taking Venom, Lethal Protector is almost a must-have. Eyes on the Prize, great unaffiliated card to be able to walk up and interact within 2. It could mean the difference between being able to take an objective and not. And then if you start running other characters like Scarlet Witch, No More Mutants, and she has another card, I forget the name of it, but I'll throw it up on the screen. Also really great cards to have if you're going to dual affiliation with A-Force running Special Delivery, A-Force Assemble, Stalwart Determination, all great cards. So in terms of the core for Web Warriors, I think all of the Weak Cakes, Spider Tracker, and then 2 of the 3, either Patch Up, Indomitable, and Brace for Impact would be my go-to. And then from there, you splash in a little extra depending on which heroes are in your roster. So on screen is basically my sample roster that I would typically take with my Web Warriors. For my extracts, I'm taking Struggle for the Cube Continues, Spider Infected Invade Manhattan, and Fear Grips World as Worthy Terrorize Cities. For my secures, I'm taking Cosmic Invasion, Black Order Descends on Earth, Infinity Formula Goes Missing, and Riot's Spark over Extremis 3.0. For all the reasons I mentioned in my previous section on the crises, these are low scoring, so each point is only worth 1 point, but there's a lot of them. There's 4 or 5 objective markers or assets on the board, and the deployment type forces the objectives to be spread out over the entire board, which means that teams that don't have a lot of activations, aren't running wide, or don't move quickly across the board are going to struggle to take these objectives. and it plays right into the way Web Warriors want to play the game. For my roster, I'm taking Amazing Spider-Man, Miles Morales, Ghost Spider, Black Cat, She-Hulk, Domino, Scarlet Witch, Crystal, Shuri, and Okoye. Essentially, this is my Web Warrior core in terms of the top 4. And then I splash in a lot of A-Force members. One, because a lot of the A-Force members I'm bringing here shore up some of those weaknesses that I mentioned for my Web Warriors. Scarlet Witch, for example, brings a lot of mystic attacks, and for a 5 threat, she is incredibly powerful, really controls her side of the board, and she has to be dealt with, which draws attention away from the Web Warriors. Domino has a lot of energy attacks, hands up Incinerate, which makes my attacks more effective. Crystal, also a lot of energy attacks, and she also has a lot of pushes and pulls and throws on her triggers. And then Shuri can push models off objectives without having to spend power to do so, and Okoye as a cheap 2 threat to fill in the gaps. If I then choose to run A-Force, I have She-Hulk as my leader. I can splash in my Web Warriors, and then taking Crystal as a flying long mover means I can proc special delivery. Speaking of tactics cards, we have All Webbed Up, Aunt May's Wheat Cakes, and Spider Tracker for the Web Warriors affiliated ones. Taking A-Force Assemble, Special Delivery, and Stalwart Termination as my A-Force affiliated cards. No More Mutants is specific to Scarlet Witch, so I only bring it in if I take Scarlet Witch in my team, but it means I can shut down a key power for a turn. And then for my remaining 3 unaffiliated, Eyes on the Prize for an extra range of objective interaction, and then Patch Up for healing, and Brace for impact. Patch Up is probably something I will field less with the Web Warriors and more when I bring the A-Force, specifically She-Hulk. Because She-Hulk doesn't daze, she only has 20 hit points and then she KOs. Being able to heal her means I can effectively keep her in the fight. And then A-Force doesn't have any power or any issue with power generation, so I'm going to have that 5 power for someone else to spend around She-Hulk. And then because she's going to be bodyguarding, they're going to be in range 2 anyways, so the card synergizes very, very well. And then Brace for Impact is just, it's a throw meta. Juggernaut, Hulk, Hulkbuster, She-Hulk. There's a lot of people that can throw. So Brace for Impact just means that I can negate some of the damage on my heroes and hopefully stop them from being dazed or KO'd from that throw. Now, of course, if you don't want to run a dual affiliation, you can definitely drop some of these characters. You can take others that may suit your fancy, what you have in your collection, what you want to play, and that will also change up the tactics cards that you do end up fielding. So don't take this as a definitive list, but more so as here's what I would bring with Web Warriors and my reasoning behind it. So that's it for this video. I know that it gets a little rambly at times because there's so many things to talk about. I do get excited about the game, and I feel like a lot of these points interconnect. So hopefully in my editing, I made a cohesive argument for all of my points, and I was able to string it together into some sort of cohesive video essay, which I guess essentially is what it is. Hopefully it helps to break down some of the Web Warriors' strengths and weaknesses, and you're able to take that knowledge, apply it not just to your own Web Warriors roster, but also to maybe some of the other affiliations that you're thinking of playing, because I think a lot of the core concepts in terms of how you pick your crises, how you pick your team roster to bring the tools for the crises, and then how you build your crises cards and your team roster cards to basically fill up some of the weaknesses and be able to play a very toolbox team applies to every affiliation you want to play in the game. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like. Follow my YouTube channel for more awesome weekly content. And if you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll have links in the video description below. As always, until next time, happy hobbying.